Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Chitheads. My guest today is Neil Dalal. Neil is Associate Professor of South Asian Philosophy and Religious Thought at the University of Alberta, where he teaches in both the Philosophy Department and Religious Studies program. He received his PhD in Asian Cultures and Languages from the University of Texas at Austin, where he specialized in Sanskrit and Indian philosophy, and an MA in East-West Psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies. Dalal's interests explore philosophy of mind, contemplative psychologies, and meditation practices found in classical South Asian yoga systems. He grounds this research in classical Sanskrit texts and commentaries, as well as their living traditions. Dalal's current research focuses on the intersections of contemplative practices, textual study, and embodiment in Advaita Vedanta. He is the co-director of Gurukulam, a sensory ethnographic study of a contemporary Advaita Vedanta community, co-editor of Asian Perspectives on Animal Ethics, and has published articles in venues such as the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, Journal of Indian Philosophy, and Journal of Hindu Studies. Dalal is also a teacher within the traditional lineage of Shankaracharya's Advaita Vedanta. He spent several years living a monastic lifestyle in India while studying under the direct guidance of the renowned Advaita Vedantin Swami Dayananda Saraswati, who gave him permission to teach in 2002. So, hello, Neil. How are you?
Good. It's good to see you and meet you in sort of person.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to chat with you today. And I wanted to start off just where I've recently been preparing for this episode, which is watching the documentary Gurukulam, which you created a couple of years ago, I believe. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is a really beautiful documentary, which you did while staying at this Advaita Vedanta community in Tamil Nadu, India, called Gurukulam. Is it correct to call it an ashram?
Yeah, I mean, Gurukulam literally means a place, well, literally means family of the teacher, but it means a place of traditional study. So you could call it an ashram, but Gurukulam has a little more of that sense of rigorous study involved in it.
I see. Well, what I thought really stood out about the documentary, especially given your other role as a scholar, is that it wasn't overly discursive in the sense that you really focused on kind of letting the sensory experience speak for itself, which I thought was really interesting, given that you are a scholar and are perhaps prone to analyzing things. So, what was your inspiration behind creating a documentary that was very much not in the kind of analytical, scholarly vein that you might be accustomed to in academia?
That's a good question. So when in the academy, majority of work on Advaita Vedanta, there's a lot, is very textual, philosophical, and it's somewhat reductive of what the tradition actually is. And it's lent this sort of attitude or implicit understanding that Vedanta is just about non-duality, which is obviously the main thrust of it. But it's been totally disembodied from the tradition, from the practices and whatnot. And so my experiences in the tradition were so different than what I consume and even what I produce as a scholar, that I wanted to show that. Mm-hmm. And so, and we use this particular method called sensory ethnography, which is not discursive, as you said, because it's trying to get people to be in that experience and see the experience of being there, rather than like kind of stepping back and just being in some analytical discourse of what is this, trying to always interpret, which pulls you out of what it would be to actually be there.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was
it was
the inspiration.
Yeah, it was interesting that it definitely invoked a mood, but it wasn't a mood that was kind of overwritten by choices in music, which is typically there's a bit of manipulation, I think, generally in a documentary. It's like the documentary wants you to feel a particular way, and so they use certain kind of devices, literary devices, to kind of move you in that direction. But this very much wasn't that, and I think And I also read, of course, your article that you wrote about the documentary. So I also knew a little bit about the intention behind it. But it was very powerful in that way. And I'm wondering if, well, one, I wanted to ask you: is this in your biography? You mentioned that you had an experience living in a traditional setting. Was this the place where you did your more monastic lifestyle, where you lived the
Yeah,
more
well,
monastic lifestyle?
this is the lineage in which I studied. And I spent a lot of time in that Gurukulam in Tamil Nadu,
Mm.
which is really what gave us access. Because I knew the people there, and they were willing to allow us to come in and film. Otherwise, there was no possibility of that. Uh, yeah, so there, and there's a couple other ashram gurukulams, one in Rishikesh, one in Nagpur, and one in Pennsylvania,
Mm.
where I spent a lot of time as well.
Oh, I see. So the same sort of community or the same lineage is connected to these various
Yeah,
ashrams across. Okay,
yeah.
and
It's called the Arsha Vidya lineage.
I see. So, what brought you to this path initially? I mean, I know your descent obviously is Indian, but was this something that was already a part of kind of what you were immersed in as a child, or is this something that sort of came along gradually?
Not as a child. I mean, I grew up, so I was born and raised in Boston, or just outside of Boston in the suburbs. And so I grew up in a Hindu family, immigrant family, and we were surrounded by in the Indian community in that western suburb, the suburbs of Boston. We were go to Hindu functions and whatnot. But no, I wasn't very religious. It does turn out that my maternal family traces their lineage, at least in legend, to the grand teacher of Shankara named Gaudapada, who wrote a really famous text called the Gaudapada Katakas. But that wasn't part of our like narrative. It was, well, long story short, it was a long story. But when I was 18, my first year at university, I just got into spirituality, meditation, martial arts, and just started exploring it and got completely consumed by it.
Mm.
And over some years, exploring these different things. This is the early '90s, so there's no internet or anything. It's like catching whatever I can, exploring whatever I could, and then I came to non-duality, and that really grabbed me, because I knew I wanted to understand that, but I didn't know how to understand it. And I had taken courses in Asian religions, so I knew it was there, and I started reading, Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita, also Buddhist texts and other texts that were talking about non-duality. But I knew I couldn't understand it, and eventually I found a teacher in California named Kara Whitfield at CIS, where I did my MA. And through her, I met Swami Dayananda Saraswati, and eventually pretty early on, I planned to go an academic route after that, to continue studying.
Mm.
So yeah, that's the very long story and a pretty short version.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious a little bit about sort of the gap, if you experienced a gap between kind of the Hindu cultural backdrop that you grew up in, and the study of the esoteric. I mean, did that seem like something that you would have been led to the knowledge of prior, or is it something that you only kind of discovered as a result of your own study?
My parents, and I would say the whole community we were involved in at that time, they had no idea what Vedanta was.
Right.
I mean, everyone knows Bhagavad Gita. They know what the Upanishads are. I think the beautiful thing in Hindu culture is that the possibility of these practices are there.
Right.
So everyone knows it's part of the cultural archetypes. I grew up actually really loving Indian mythology. And so it was sort of like, I also liked fantasy and sci-fi. So that was sort of like the Indian version of that for me. And so I had these archetypes of the yogis and the sages and the forest ascetics, and I have these questions. Why would these kings give up their kingdom to go into the forest and meditate? So that was there in some latent way, not very conscious, I think. But when I came into Vedanta, I realized how much I had actually been exposed to. But majority of the people we grew up with I'd say my mother was quite traditional. My maternal family, they're what we call karmatas. They're ritualists.
Yeah.
And so every day she would do her puja twice a day. And so I grew up with that, but my father wasn't at that time very interested. And so it was sort of, we're growing up as Indian Americans, and religion didn't play a big part in our lives. So I don't know if that quite answers the question.
No, it does. And I guess the question of kind of the function of ritual is a good segue into a little bit more that I wanted to talk about with regards to the documentary, because as some people know, and we talked about this before we started the interview, as many people associate Vedanta with the liberation particular to knowledge and a certain kind of knowledge, right? And so the ritual or the actions that are particular to different kind of religious dispositions tend to be considered less than important, or in fact not actually conducive to realizing enlightenment in some way. But in the documentary, it was very apparent that the kind of study of the text, what you describe as after Gavin Flood, is intextualization, and this experience of studying the text as a way of sort of being written by the text. And that seems to be central, but then it's also alongside all of this ritual, in terms of chanting and puja, and there even, there's even the presence of kind of more anthropomorphic images, particularly those of Shiva. So I'm interested sort of about the intersection of all of these things. What is the role of ritual in a community of Vedantins that are, at least on paper, consider, the road to enlightenment to be one purely of knowledge?
Oh, wow. Okay. So it's a great question, because it's true that in terms of the philosophy of Advaita, there is I wouldn't say a conflict, but a distinction between what can action do for you, any action, and versus knowledge. Mm-hmm. And that action includes ritual action, devotional actions, as well as meditation, right? So they consider meditation or complex envisioning, visualization practices, or mindfulness or whatever. These are all mental actions. And so the basic argument is that actions produce results. Yourself, non-dual consciousness, is not a result. It's not something that can be in causation. It can't be produced. It can't be reached. It can't be gained. It can't be purified. And they go into a whole, really technical discussion of the why karma, action, is not a means of knowledge and doesn't lead to knowledge in the way that perception does or other means of knowledge. And so this has been taken I think academically to some degree, and also in the popular movements of Neo-Advaita, and also the popular interpretations of what Advaita is, that therefore all actions, all rituals, all devotional practices are, completely useless. Mm-hmm. And that's not the point. And the point is that it's not going to lead to full knowledge, full moksha, full liberation. But the tradition is very clear that we use those practices to help us become qualified students for knowledge. Mm. Right. So if you try and go into an Advaita process or study and you don't incorporate any of those practices, the tradition will say, well, you're going to fail very quickly. Also, I should also include ethical practices. So developing compassion and kindness and living a dharmic life. So this is part of the reduction of Advaita as this is cold, non-dual tradition, and then in some contemporary traditions, or what some people call neo-Advaitins, I don't know if it's fair to generalize with these groups because they're very diverse, but there's sometimes an idea that there's nowhere to go, there's no path, there's no sadhana, there's no practice. You already are what you seek to be. You already are non-dual consciousness, so don't do anything because then you're basically undermining yourself. Mm-hmm. So that's not false. But if you try and jump to that understanding, you're just going to be treading water,
right,
from a traditionalist perspective. The tradition is not saying talking is a problem. Mm-hmm. So in the traditional methodology, actually, this comes out of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. There's a triple process of study for knowledge, and one is listening, one is logical reflection, and by the way, that's also lost in a lot of contemporary communities, spiritual communities in general, that we can really intellectually, rigorously question and critique and try and understand that way. So listening, reflection, and then third is a contemplative understanding of what you have understood through listening and reflection. So this first one, listening, what's called Shravana, means that the teacher is talking. So talking is central, and the student listening. Except here's a distinction that I would make, at least the tradition makes, is that there are very particular ways of how to unfold the vision of non-duality according to particular methods. And if you don't have those methods, and there's a really amazing, beautiful, and technical discussions of what these methods are and how they function. If you don't have those methods, then it's just verbal intellectualizing, and it's just conceptual understanding. Obviously, non-duality is not subject to words. Mm-hmm. And there's some really famous verses, like in the Taittiriya Upanishad, there's one where it says, words turn back. They can't approach that Brahman, that non-dual. But if you can use paradox, you can use what certain kinds of implication, getting to connotative senses of terms. And there's all these really sophisticated methods for how to use the words to allow someone to understand. So that's what we call pramana, which means a means of knowledge. So that the words become a means of knowledge, testimony. And it can function, if it's employed properly by a teacher who understands how to do that, it becomes like a mirror of words to reflect back at yourself. So rather than refracting elsewhere, which words usually do, you're able to turn it back and see yourself through the words. Now the problem is, or the difficulty is, for the student to engage that process of listening properly, they require a lot of inner work. So just to give you an example, if I say, if you're in a dark room and I say, okay, I want you to see this object, use your eyesight, you have to do several actions. You have to turn the lights on, maybe you have to put your glasses on, you have to turn your head so that you're facing the object. And once all the conditions are met for the means of knowledge to work in your visual perception, that object is immediately known. Right? And you can't unknow it. You can't be looking at the object and going, that's not a cup, or whatever. If I hold the cup up and say, what is this? And you can't say it's an elephant. Right? If everything is aligned properly, right? Mm-hmm. So that's what we're trying to do in Advaita, is line everything up. But to line everything up for the listening, the words to work, that takes a lot of practices. And there's many of them. Right. So from meditation to devotional practices to, Dayananda Saraswati, my teacher, he was really saw the importance of recognize. We this term Ishvara, which for your listeners, I hate translating this as God, because that brings up a whole bunch of problematic assumptions in English. But Ishvara, the true nature of the divine, Shiva, Vishnu, whatever we want to call it. As everything in the universe, including my mind, including my body. And it's sort of like the order that moves through all things. And so recognizing that and appreciating that, this is much the topic in the Bhagavad Gita, becomes a process of psychological growth through, if you want to call that, devotional practices or karma yoga. And so that is one of the most central ways of aligning the pramana, aligning the means of knowledge, so that the recognition can take place. So it's subsidiary practices, which doesn't get you to the goal, but allows you to see it.
Yeah. So the presence of Shiva as Dakshinamurti in Gurukulam, is that essentially a manifestation of Ishvara in according to what you're saying?
Yeah, definitely. And just to add along with that, so everyone practicing Advaitins, at least within this lineage that I'm most familiar with, they all come with different degrees of knowledge and different experiences, and of course you have also people of Hindu descent and people of Westerners, right? So now you're coming from very different places. And so in the beginning, maybe you're relating to the deity as an anthropomorphic figure, as a murti in the temple. And as you grow, you come to understand that you are a part of Ishvara, as a part to the whole, like a wave to the ocean. And then your relationship changes very much. And we're doing all these practices and understanding of how. So just for example, the elements are Ishvara, right? So you're relating externally, everything becomes Ishvara. And then internally, you have presiding deities of every function. Like your speech is the goddess Vak. Mm-hmm. Your eyes, your mind, all your physiological functions. These are all deified, and so these are all ways of seeing yourself as the whole, as Ishvara, and this becomes a way of developing equanimity. So even the temple, sorry to go on one other little tangential line here. Even the temple functions in this really important way where when you go to a Hindu temple, any Hindu would jive with this experience. You make food offerings, right? Sometimes you do it yourself, like at home. Sometimes the pujari, the priest, will do it in the temple, and then they do there's darshan of the deity, sees the food, blesses the food becomes sacred, and at the end of the ritual, they give it back to you, and then you consume the food, right? And it's called prasada. Now, personally, when I go to a temple, well, you never know what you're going to get, and sometimes you like it. Like for me, I love the tiny bananas in India, in South India, especially, like these, just the sweetest bananas ever.
They're so sweet. And
sometimes you get something you really don't like. So, for example, I cannot stand the essence of rose water when it's dumped on food. This is a common, and it's very auspicious, right? This rose essence. But here's the thing: is when you get that prasad, you can't say no. You can't say, "Well, I don't like that." This is one of these things I learned as a kid. My mom would force me, like, I never really actually liked Indian sweets. But she would force me, like, no, this is from the temple. You have to eat this. Like, fine, I'll take one little piece. She'd be like, okay. But that there's a kind of equanimity in terms of your preferences there. Mm-hmm. And so the devotional practices, like especially in the Bhagavad Gita, the way we look at the Gita, one part of it is that whatever actions you do are offerings to Ishvara, and whatever results come back, which are outside of your control, are like the prasada from the temple, and you accept it. You don't have to like it, but you accept it. And so these are so that develops equanimity, what's called samatvam, and this is a central prerequisite for understanding.
So one thing that you keep mentioning that I just wanted to sort of tangentially bring up is the concept of karma yoga. And a lot of people in sort of the modern day yoga community, I think, associate that term with like doing good works or, volunteering. Seva, basically. And so as you're describing it, karma yoga really is a description of that approach to practice, which is about ritual action, devotional practices, and the like. So do you think there's anything problematic about this sort of appropriation of karma yoga as being something other than the rituals themselves, particularly in a Western context where that's the first thing that gets thrown out? They're like, look at this empty ritual. Like, that doesn't mean anything to me. I don't understand the significance of it. It's sort of, it's just sort of like, it reminds me of something I experienced in my, Christian upbringing where I had to do this empty ritual thing. So, what are your sort of thoughts on that? The difference between like the way the West has appropriated the concept of karma yoga and as it's essentially traditionally defined.
Well, first, I can really empathize with the questions around ritual because I felt the same way. You know, growing up, I didn't my I would I probably didn't ask my mother that much, but the times I would ask her, she'd be like, you know, we just do it this way, and I didn't understand what was being chanted, and I didn't understand why all the materials and all the stuff. It was beautiful, and you know, maybe a fun family event, but I didn't get it. And it took a long time in the tradition for me to develop the appreciation of the rituals. And what's really amazing when you start looking into the meanings of the rituals and you understand the meanings of the chants, there's so much wisdom in there. It's
Yeah.
all it's right there, but it's kind of like it's hiding. And also in the mythology, the sacred narratives, and all that stuff. And once you start understanding on, for me at least, it was understanding on sort of the meta level, the higher level in the philosophical level, and then I started seeing it all manifesting on this very material level or verbal chanting level. That gave me the appreciation for it. So that's just one thing. When it comes to the karma yoga question, I think it's just a terminological issue.
Mm.
It's really, we should call that this doing work for the sake of work or volunteering. We should just call it seva.
Yeah.
So when we say it's karma yoga, and then we assume if people are calling it karma yoga and it's actually volunteer work, and they think what they're doing is what the Bhagavad Gita is telling you to do, now you have a misinterpretation. And I think on a broader level, what a critique I would have, or a recommendation I would have, is that we live in a world of a spiritual but not religious world within the modern yoga kind of communities where we're very non-textual oriented. And these communities tend to be sometimes anti-intellectual,
Yeah.
and anti-critical. And maybe the only text people would delve into is the Yoga Sutras and sometimes the Bhagavad Gita. But then the problem is that they use Western interpretations. So this is a long. I don't want to go into this too. We can delve
No,
into
this
it
is
more.
juicy stuff. Keep going.
I'll give you an example. I teach courses on classical yoga sutras, Patanjali's Yoga Darshana, and also courses on modern yoga. And sometimes I'll do these exercises with my students. Where I'll give them a assignment where they need to take the classical text with its commentaries, and then a contemporary text that's interpreting the Yoga Sutras, and do a comparison. And sometimes they cannot recognize the classical text in the modern one at all.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things I find this all the time on like yoga groups on Facebook or some yoga teachers I meet, where there's this idea that you should just intuit the meaning of these texts. That, okay, I'll take this line. Sometimes it'll be in Sanskrit, even not even in the translation. They'll go, just listen in your heart. What does it mean? This is not part of the tradition. Mm-hmm. This is actually, and there's a lot of interesting work going on tracing the American metaphysical background of how modern yoga interprets yoga.
Yeah.
Or modern spirituality in general, spiritual but not religious kind of communities. And these kinds of practices go back to the Theosophical Society and other groups, and it's not part of the tradition. So, and it's led to a lot of misinterpretation. It's led to a lot of people sort of just laying down the lines of interpretation that they want the text to have, right? So there's selective bias and a lot of other stuff. And so I think this is, it's actually destructive. And it's part of the larger problem of cultural appropriation. Like when you are, two things. One, when you're misinterpreting a text according to the tradition. And then secondly, if you're a teacher or someone doing social media or branding yourself using this stuff, where you're putting it out there authoritatively, now you have a double issue, right? If someone's just doing it on their own, you know, that's one thing. But when teachers are doing it, I think there's a deeper issue. So yeah, I think karma yoga is not totally wrong, because in the Bhagavad Gita there is this idea that you do your duty for the sake of the duty, and you accept the results. But if you strip Ishvara out of karma yoga in the Bhagavad Gita, it's not karma yoga anymore. And this, by the way, is just another little another little side note here. People always look at the Bhagavad Gita and they say there's three yogas. There's karma yoga, there's yoga of action, there's jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge, and there's bhakti yoga, the knowledge of devotion, or the yoga of devotion, sorry. There's no third yoga in the Bhagavad Gita. You'll find nowhere in the text where it says there's three yogas. You'll see multiple times there's two yogas. All right, so in the beginning of the third chapter, Arjuna is saying, Krishna, you're telling me there's these two yogas. Which one is better? All right, which of the two? So there's no stripping of bhakti yoga from karma yoga. Karma yoga is bhakti yoga. And anyone who's saying there's three yogas is in my opinion, misinterpreting the text. There are later traditions in India that do make a claim for three yogas. So I don't want to dismiss them. But from a textual perspective, there's only two yogas.
Love
so
it.
yeah, Ishvara and karma yoga are tied together. You can't separate them.
So I want to go back. I want to go back a little bit because I love this line of thought and discussion. And just to kind of comment on one of the things you were saying about the metaphysical assumptions backdrop of kind of modern spiritual interpretations, and there's there's a lot of sort of complex issues at play, like especially with regards to the now backlash against sort of traditional guru-shishya relationships because of all of the abuses that have taken place. And then, of course, you also have sort of liberal individualism playing as an ideology, sort of like, oh, everything is within, and like, the abundance of life is all within me, and all I need to do is just, tap into my inner guru. But of course, anybody that studied anything in life and hope to perfect knowledge in any particular way knows that they need a teacher. But that seems to be forgotten. So there's all of these things sort of playing into this this resistance to. And then I really appreciated what you were pointing out about the anti-intellectualism, because this is something that I really experience a lot too, is these people, this false dichotomy between feeling and knowledge, and the sense that like yoga is just about like feeling, and the knowledge is superfluous, or it's some sense sort of like an abstraction from my experience, rather than knowledge actually conditioning the possibility of experience. So there's all these kinds of, fuzzy presuppositions that are sort of at play in all of this, and so I'm just wondering, what your position is on all of that, just to go deeper into this juicy topic, and what you think the solution, part of the solution might be.
Yeah, it's really. I mean, it's so. It seems like just in the past few years, the whole discourse has erupted in a way that it hadn't before. One quick thing I would say, and I'll tie this back into the Guru discussion, is that in Vedanta, in traditional Vedanta, there is a really deep critique of what we would call experience hunting. So understanding non-duality is not an experience of non-duality. I would qualify as I would say there is a phenomenology of the knower of non-duality. There's something different about when you know versus when you don't know, or to whatever degree of clarity you have. But non-duality is not something you try and experience. So this is a major misconception in contemporary spirituality, contemporary non-dualism, and also in many of the yoga communities, especially who talk about oneness a lot, where and it's also a critique of the Yoga Sutras as well, that if experience is transitory. Right. So first of all, what does it mean to experience non-duality? It's not an object. So then you go, okay, well, there's non-dual experience where subject-object divisions, dissolve or fall apart. But Shankara, the great, our earliest commentator on the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita and and the Brahma Sutras, and the most well-known, or the most influential Advaitin, he actually critiques this in several places and says, well, what knowledge are you going to gain? Right. So, for example, if we have a room with 20 people, or however many people, and somehow they all have a samadhi non-dual experience, And then after that experience, you give them all a piece of paper and say, okay, now write down, what does this mean about yourself? Who are you in reality? What's your relationship to the world? What's your relationship to Ishvara? And you might get 20 different answers, which might contradict each other, right? So now what kind of knowledge comes out of that? And what happens instead is that people are, I think, this is not just here in the West, I mean, in India too, is that we've become so bent on a conception of spirituality, which is so experientially heavy, that we're craving these kind of ecstatic experiences or sattvic experiences or deep states of quietude or joy or whatever it is. And then we get addicted to that. And we're always searching for it. And that's a long critique, which we can come back to. But I want to tie this into the guru equation, because I think part of the problem in the guru mentality of the people who are seeking gurus is that they want the guru to give them an enlightenment experience. So going to Ammachi, the famous hugging saint, right? People go and they get her hug and they have this encounter with this, let's charitably assume that she's actually this manifesting the goddess within her, and that they have that encounter and they have these transformative experiences, and then they want to keep going back to her, right? Or people want to go to find the enlightened guru and have the guru enlighten them. And they're looking for this experience. And I think this is part of what has made people approach gurus in a way that allows the abusive behavior to happen in the first place. Right? It's a misunderstanding of what does a guru actually do. And so that's one thing. And now to tie that back into the discourse, the anti-guru discourse, what you're getting at, I think is so. It's obviously not black and white. There are real issues, right? Several gurus. I mean, it seems like every week we have a new guru who's being called out for some kind of sexual abuse, or some power abuse, or something. And I think rightfully so, that they need to be called out. They need to be taken off their pedestal. But really, we shouldn't be putting teachers on that kind of pedestal in the first place. So there's a couple things here. Sorry, I have too many ideas. I'm trying to pick which one to go with. But one thing I find that has been concerning to me about this is that, so I certainly agree that there's a problem, and I think it goes both ways between the gurus and the students, giving the kind of power to the guru and the institutions, these sort of inside members, inner circles, protecting gurus, silencing, all that stuff, right? There's so much of that. On the other hand, the discourse, I think, is also inflected by cultural appropriation and racism, in that there has become I sense that there's a sort of anti-India sentiment that ties into this, and it's very convenient to put all Indian teachers under the bus. And I think we have to have some viveka, some discrimination between recognizing the need for teachers, Indian or non-Indian, men or women, whatever sexual preference. That's like the non-issue there. But the role of a teacher is important. And we don't go into. I can't think of any practice I would go into that's difficult, where I say I'm going to figure it out on my own. Right? And we live in a kind of weird world today, because you can say I'm going to learn how to breakdance off YouTube, right? And so you can listen to a lot of discourses online and stuff like that. But the need for a teacher is, like, if you were going to learn music on your own, like I'm not going to go and learn piano and think I'm going to teach myself. Maybe I could do it. I think actually spirituality, or in my case Vedanta, is more complicated, because you're dealing with psychological stuff. You're dealing with practice of meditation. You really need that one-to-one relationship with a teacher, where you can question, ask, resolve doubts, ask for guidance. What I think is happening is that the very term guru has been appropriated and put with a negative connotation. And that's what I think is really disturbing to me, is that now we throw the guru out, and we're throwing the whole possibility of learning out then. and then we try and learn on our own. And I did that myself. I had several teachers actually prior to coming to Vedanta, and but I was trying to do like a collage or some kind of syncretic piecemeal creating my own spirituality, which I think is what is central to the SBNR, the spiritual but not religious community, is that you have your own agency. That's beautiful in many ways, and then you to agency to do whatever you want, however you want. But but people get lost, right? Because they don't know what they're doing, they don't know where they're going, they don't know the pitfalls they're falling into. They don't know a destination, and they have no compass at the same time. And then you're just putting all these pieces together, and you don't know, especially if you kind of let the dominoes fall of what are the presuppositions of these different positions and these different traditions they might be. So, you go, oh, I'm going to go do ayahuasca in Peru with some shaman, or some Westerner who's going to be a shaman. And then I'm going to go do some mindfulness or Vipassana retreat. And then I'm going to go do some yoga asana practice. And then I'm going to do a little, classical non-dual tantra. But I don't, maybe I'll add a little Dzogchen non-dualism and a little Advaita Vedanta non-dualism. And I'll just going to put it all together. And I'm going to intuit my own ideas. I'm going to go to a psychotherapist. And there's a lot of growth that takes place through all that. But people don't understand what the conflicts are and how it's all working together. And so I think the need for a teacher is central. I also empathize with the skepticism, and I myself am very skeptical of people who claim to be gurus, and especially the big name gurus, right? Because I find that Western and Indian ones, like there's a great deal of performance involved, and they may be very charismatic, they may be very intelligent, but I often am skeptical of why are they pushing so hard to become gurus? What are their lineages, and what authority do they have? What do they really know? So I think there has to be a balance, basically. We need the skepticism, we need to be protective of the abuse, we need to call out abuse when it happens, we need to step away when it happens. We need to figure out, a real poignant issue is when you have learned a lot from a guru, and then you realize the abuse they've done. How do you hold that knowledge? These are things we need to work with, but I don't think we can just walk off on our own and think we're going to find a way. Not to moksha. If you're pursuing real freedom, and you're not just pursuing like performance enhancement, which is a lot of or wellness, which is a lot of what spirituality has become, then the guru is essential.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask kind of a follow-up question to that, which is, do you think that it's two sides of the same racist coin, that we've moved so dramatically from a period of history of a hyper-exoticization of Indian teachers, and it's sort of like gone completely in the opposite direction, and now it's sort of is it the same kind of racism functioning that turns all Indian teachers into like gods from some kind of sacred plane, and then sort of turns them into objects of ridicule and disdain? Like, because if they hadn't been so high on the pedestal, they wouldn't have had so far to fall.
Yeah, I do. Well, first of all, I think just to quickly point out that I generally don't think, I think of this as institutional issues, not as individual issues.
Right.
So a lot of people, especially people who are not people of color, so white people, there's a tendency to think of racism as like malevolent action, malevolent intention.
Yeah.
And I think that's not. To take the yoga community, I love the yoga community. I have so many friends in the yoga, in the what I say is an intersection of the spiritual but not religious and the yoga community. In so many ways, I love the culture. I have deep admiration and empathy, and it's also a very cool culture. It's a super cool, like they're the cool kids, in many ways, and so I have a lot of appreciation, and I don't think, and especially in the sense that almost every yoga person I know genuinely, honestly, are coming from a good place with a good heart, trying to do their best and grow their most and help and be helpful to other people. And
Yeah.
so there's a real kindness in the community. So just to be clear in that level, but I think institutionally, of course there are exceptions to that, but institutionally, um, it's a bigger issue with the way yoga has gone and the way in the underlying premises of spiritual but not religiosity, because I do think it's a religious movement, even though it's quote unquote not religious.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think what you're saying is interesting way of looking at it, because there's this earlier exotification, kind of Orientalism of Indian wisdom, Eastern wisdom in general, and now we live in this world where we're flipped maybe to the exact opposite side and start dismissing it all and saying we don't need any of that anymore and there's nothing there. And so, yeah, we don't need the teachers, we don't need the texts, we don't need the quote unquote dogma, we don't need the quote unquote institutions. But here's the thing: is that when in a lot of the spirituality which does that extracts, so now there's a process of extraction and whitewashing it and covering up its kind of cultural origins and trying to extract it so there's no culture at all. Yet implicit, there's still this idea that then they are doing an ancient practice, right? So there's still the cachet value of the ancientness, of the Indianness or the Easternness, even though the very concept of East versus West is problematic. But
Yeah.
and so you can say like I'm doing an asana posture practice, which on one hand is just posture, and it can be taught as fitness, it can be taught as more like a physical therapy kind of practice, but it's still this, 4,000, it's not 4,000 years old, but you'll see this on yoga websites. We're doing something that's 4,000 years old or ancient, but we're going to teach it in this way, which is totally non-Indian. So even the yoga studios, which will say like on their door, no Sanskrit words in this studio as a selling point,
Ugh.
there's still this idea that they're doing something ancient. And so they're, on one hand, they're trying to tap into that value and then extracting it in a way that fits a market. And to me, it's all about economics. So the capitalist issues underlying the marketing and branding of yoga is closely tied to issues of appropriation and exoticism or anti-exoticism or guru versus non-guru. And people don't really see that.
So I'm wondering what the mode of intellectual approach to these teachings, how this plays into the problems around cultural appropriation. And when I ask that, I'm thinking specifically of what I'm seeing just generally, and it might just be my sensitivity to it, but I think it is taking place, is this turn from perhaps having, like, let's say in a yoga teacher training, setting aside whether or not, a tuner or yoga teacher training, if it has anything to do with the authentic path of yoga. But let's just talk about that for a second. There seems to be, or there was, at least, when I initially did that, and there was this sort of desire to teach the teachings from within, the kind of devotional standpoint from which they derive, or there was a sense of teaching the philosophy from the perspective of what it's essentially meant to cultivate. And it seems like there's kind of a shift toward now studying the philosophy from a kind of externalized point of view, or it's like, so rather than having devotional yoga leaders teaching yoga philosophy, you have yoga studies scholars teaching like about yoga philosophy as if it's sort of an archaeological find, like it's sort of separate from us, and like this is a more sort of, this is being presented as a more responsible way to study these things because it doesn't actually take a stand on the soteriological views of the tradition itself. But is that in and of itself like a misappropriation of yoga to imply that the study of yoga philosophy itself is somehow is just an abstracted scholarly activity? Isn't that appropriating it according to the terms of a kind of Western objectivist academic orientation?
Ooh, it's getting me in some hot water here. It's interesting. It's interesting because there are a lot of critiques of academia as being cultural appropriation. Well, I say maybe academia in general, because academia in general is a white institution, and if you come, I'm not going to argue for this, but a lot of people who do, like, let's say, critical race studies or people in anti-race activism would come to the table with the premise that any institution that holds power and that is mostly white holds racist ideologies in it. So that can be debated. But if that's the case, of course, academia is no different than government or mega corporations or whatever. And so there's one deeper, very deep question of in what ways is racism and appropriation or colonialism functioning within the academy as a whole, and then to close it, to narrow it down, how is that functioning in South Asian religions, or within the institution of scholars who study South Asian religions, or specifically in the yoga studies, which is a really small community. It's really just, I don't know, 20, 30 people really doing that, modern yoga or modern yoga and really medieval yoga. Mm-hmm. So that's a hard question. I don't really know the answer to that, and I think there's no interest in really pursuing that question within the field, which I think is actually there's stuff that's about to come out or is coming out in the next few years of some scholars working on the issues of appropriation, and but there's a very little reflexive awareness within the field of South Asian religions on how we being affected by how is the field manifesting these issues unintentionally, maybe unknowingly, but still doing that, which is very different because just to give an example, in anthropology, an ethnographer has to be very clear about their positionality, right? Who are they? What are they coming to encountering another culture? And they often in their work state that, right? I'm so and so. These are the kind of implicit biases I might have given my positionality. So this whole reflexivity kind of issue, we don't do that in religious studies generally. In South Asian religions, no one writes a book looking at, like, a critique of medieval Hatha yoga or like Shaivism out of Kashmir or whatever, and state their positionality and why they might be taking the certain positions they do. And so it's just not done generally. Mm. So I do think there's a bigger issue with that. But coming to more specifically with your question, in terms of yoga teacher trainings, I don't know, because yoga is so broad and so big and such a massive, I don't know what in the United States alone, what we have like 35 million yoga practitioners or something, right? Mm-hmm. And then the teacher trainings are one of the biggest cash cows for studios. And, we have this proliferation of studios. The studios are increasing, especially the small independent studios are under increasing pressure, right? They're barely surviving. It's becoming corporate studios. And again, it's come down to market and branding. And the majority, as yoga grows and grows, I think it's probably a minority of yoga. I don't know the numbers, but I'm guessing a minority of yoga practitioners who are really interested in going deep into a more traditional yoga practice, going beyond asana itself, yeah. Right? How many yoga studios do anything more than asana? Maybe a little pranayama, a little breath work, maybe a little meditation. That meditation is also being popularized by the contemporary meditation movement, right? Which is also secularized meditation generally.
Yeah.
Um, and that's it. It's like 95% asana, maybe 4%, 3 or 4% pranayama, and like 1 or 2% meditation. And there's nothing else. And then the teacher trainings to me are bizarre, that it's not surprising. It's bizarre that you have 200-hour teacher trainings, and then like now you're a yoga teacher.
Yeah.
Right? It's like the lack of standards is absolutely horrendous to me.
Yeah.
If I give like an analog, because my bodily like practices have been more on the lines of martial arts, and just to give one example of now with the rise of mixed martial arts and like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is this huge thing, and there's an interesting issue coming up for Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu where traditionally to get a black belt in Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, would take like years and years and years, like 10, 15 years, 20, maybe in 20 years, and you have to prove yourself. You have to be like, if a brown belt is beating you, you can't get a black belt, right? You have to prove yourself. And the 200-hour teacher training is so flimsy. I don't really get it. That's one thing, and so but it fits because now they have to make money. 200-hour teacher training, whatever people are charging, like you can pump them out. You can do 2 a year or more. And now you have this super saturation of yoga teachers who can't get jobs, and so it's all playing to this market, and the market doesn't pull for people to go deep into yoga as a practitioner. So I don't know though about this idea of what you're saying of studying yoga philosophy as a system it's very academic. Right? In fact, this is a distinction I would make between traditional study and academic studies. And so I actually have to play these two roles, right? So in academia, when I teach Vedanta or yoga philosophy or any Buddhist philosophy, I do often take the role that let's look at this as though it's true, and argue around that, like, and I'll move like, okay, we're going to do Mahayana Buddhism. Let's argue it like it's like this is a true, and critique it and argue for and against it. And we'll move to yoga philosophy, and let's look at yoga philosophy in the same way and charitably. But I'm not teaching it in a way that they need to reflect on themselves through the teaching. It's always out here. It's always like this diorama, right? They're tinkering with it and comparing. And that's why there is no growth necessary in that. And that's the sort of social contract I have with academic students, right? Implicit. Like they're not coming in to look at themselves. Sometimes a little bit, only because like almost like half of my students are dealing with some level of mental illness now. And so it feels so empty to not bring, like, at least let them dabble with a little meditation. In my philosophy classes, actually. Now, I don't do this as much in religious studies courses because religious studies is more wary of this, getting into theological practice, whereas philosophy students are more open to these kind of thought experiments. That's another whole story. But so what's going on then in the teacher trainings? They're doing the same, as you're saying, they're doing the same thing. And I don't know. It's because is that the kind of social contract they have now in those teacher trainings, that they're just, and I don't know, this ties into like yoga alliance requirements and all that sort of stuff of like, you just need so many hours of yoga philosophy and yoga history. And so I think maybe it's problematic. At the same time, I think what the knowledge that's coming out is really amazing, and I think it's empowering to know the history. Kind of coming back to the appropriation, though, I do find that the academic knowledge that are coming out of the yoga studies community, and there's really there's like, let's say 5 to 10 people are looking at their work, like Mark Singleton and Jim Mounds, and they're wonderful scholars, but their work is then being weaponized in ways to further pull away from the tradition.
Yeah.
And so, the idea that which is not really good interpretation probably of Singleton, but the idea that yoga is just as modern, asana practice is just a total modern invention, therefore you don't need to know anything about the history. And so people focus on those ideas, and it's really it's a kind of selective bias to fit their ambition to extract and isolate yoga away from India, and also gives them permission to in the agency to change it and interpret it and do whatever they want with it.
Yeah.
And so we have this really tangled web of how now, with more open source information, where the academic knowledge is being employed in ways that, and the academics now have a responsibility that they didn't have before, because they're not in the ivory tower, or the yoga studies crew at least, are not in the ivory tower. Their work is being consumed immediately now. There's this great interest, in pulling that knowledge in and sharing it. So, yeah, I don't have a yes or no black or white answer.
No, I
think
it's interesting.
I think what's important.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, what's important is that for the yoga community and the academic community to try and understand how the power dynamics are working and how the knowledge is being used and moved, and that itself is an empowering, and I think there has to be this a reflexive critique of how we're doing that.
Yeah.
But yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think what you're saying is really interesting about the yoga studies, because I have a lot of respect for them, and I've, featured them on the embodied philosophy in a variety of ways. James just did a talk for our virtual retreat. And it, one of the things that comes up afterwards with our students is, and what I think is an ongoing question is really, well, that's all very interesting, but how does it relate to my practice? And I think that in the worst case scenario, it's being imbibed a way that actually confuses people and moves them away from their practice, because it presents yoga as this historically quite alien thing, especially given, some of especially when the focus is on very alien practices that are not coupled with any sort of coherent philosophical understanding, right? So they don't really understand even why certain things were being done. And so then it makes you, it alienates you from a practice you thought was yours by introducing this sort of like historically contingent expression of yoga that was not, that isn't something you're practicing. And so I think one of the things the community is having to confront is this newfound need to understand different registers of understanding, and like understand that, okay, I can appreciate all of this research from a certain kind of from a perspective of curiosity, but then I also have to understand that there's a limit to which it's going to inform my own practice, and what are the necessary sort of, elements of knowledge that are conducive to me actually doing the work of contemplative practice and the realization of whatever subtle states of knowledge. And I think that isn't being that there's a lot of confusion in between those two things.
Yeah. So here's the thing: is that what we do these are mostly religious studies, historian type scholars, right? What we do within those fields has nothing to do with the one who's consuming the research or the one who's producing the research. It is disconnected, and that's fine. That's the name of the game, right? So that's one thing. It just quickly, before I forget, I think it's really interesting when you bring up the term alienation. And I think on one hand, I question whether this is like a new form of Orientalism happening, because we feel so alienated that those yogis become the other. The classical, probably the medieval or early 20th century yogis become like the other. And so one thing that struck me when you said that is, and the problem is who would do this, because most yoga teachers maybe would not think about it this way, but how do we inquire into that alienation? Mm-hmm. Like, how do we workshop the very feeling of alienation, and how do we understand how that's taking place, why it's taking place, what are the political consequences, what are the consequences on our practice? Like, that has to be its own discussion, because it's just happening, and people are going out of their teacher trainings or these workshops and going like, oh God, I feel like this is so weird. What am I doing? What were these people doing? And they don't have answers or like a process to work through that. I think that's one thing, is that has to be like a new wave of, to work through. But going back to the the issue in terms of the teaching is, I think you're absolutely right, because people are going into yoga not to become historians. They're going into yoga as a personal practice, and especially the people who are spiritual, whatever that spiritual means, spiritually inclined. They're looking for personal growth, and so then how do you look at these traditions for growth? And to give you one example of the kind of thing that I do in an academic class, which is different. So I teach a class called it's a philosophy class, with upper division philosophy class with a lot of graduate MA and PhD philosophy students in it. It's called Meditation and Mind, and it's looking at the theory of meditation and Indian philosophy of mind, so yoga, Vedantic, Buddhist theories of mind and consciousness. And what I'm asking them to do is do these meditation labs where they learn meditation, we talk about the theory, and we read works on Indian philosophy focusing on the mind and meditation. And then their question, the open question, is, can we use meditation as a philosophical method to look at our own phenomenological experience, and how does that function, right? And so I'm trying to bridge these two worlds, because the problem I think you're getting at is that, and this is also, by the way, what makes Vedanta a means of knowledge, is that whatever we're doing has to be looking back into ourselves, right? So academia doesn't do that. Academia is always refracting to an object other than. So how to bridge this gap? There you are, see. So how to bridge this gap and make these things like look inside of ourselves. So in the philosophy course, I'm not taking a position. I'm not trying to push a position like yoga is right, or like it's like classical hatha yoga, like James Mallison is talking about the not sampradaya or something like that. It's not the question like, are they right, or is Vedanta right? It's can we employ techniques and use that to see ourselves in some way? Does it open anything up without? And it's a little dicey line, because there are issues. Are you engaging in a religious practice or not? That's also a question in the course. We have to discuss that. But the bottom line, I think, for yoga practitioners, I think it's important to have these histories. I don't want to say that's not. I think it's actually really important. And what these scholars are doing and what they're uncovering, and it's such a new field, it's really amazing. Like, there's this whole histories that we just don't have, we don't know, that are coming to light. But from that personal growth, spiritual element or trajectory, we have to engage these traditions in a way that allow us to see something in ourselves. And I think what has happened is that there's all these amazing practices and knowledge and inquiries. A definition of Vedanta is just self-inquiry, atma vichara. And that self-inquiry goes away, and then we don't have any means to do it. Right? Or we lose the potential means that the Indian traditions have that we're not finding elsewhere. So, yeah, I think both have to be there. I think the historical, academic stuff is important, but also, how do we engage these yoga traditions, and not just hatha yoga? I guess I'm a little, to be honest, as a practitioner, not as a scholar, but as a practitioner, I'm rather biased in that I also feel quite alienated by the certain of the origins of posture practice. Right? So I'm much more moved by Vedanta, by classical Tantra, non-dual Tantra, by Mahayana, and also earlier Buddhism. And so these are the traditions that tend to speak to me in the way that they engage and the rigorous philosophy that they use, as well as their phenomenological self-inquiry meditation practices. I love asceticism and the ascetic practices, and it's also been a part of my own practices as doing some serious dabbling in that kind of stuff, especially in my youth. But there are certain elements of the medieval yoga traditions which I also struggle to sort of step into and make sense of, because we do live in this world which is so, we heroize, like rationality is our hero, right? And I see that more in the questioning and the philosophy and things like that. So yeah, I can empathize with the alienation, but we have to engage it in ways that don't just alienate it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel you. I'm definitely resonate with what you're saying because I feel the same way. And even though my asana practice is, I wouldn't say that it's outside of the orbit of my practice, but it's certainly, I consider my meditation practice and my studies to be more central, and the asana is sort of something that supports all of that. And I suppose there could be an argument that that's really what asana was intended to be, but of course, it's become sort of the central pillar. And there are, I know some individuals very close to me who want to resist sort of the pushback against or kind of the delegitimizing of asana as a central contemplative practice for those who choose to, see it that way. But it's complicated, obviously, because there is, if you're appropriating, for example, the Yoga Sutras in a way that for your asana, for your central asana practice, there is a little bit of a misappropriation going on because, of course, that wasn't what was that wasn't the fundamental practice of those who were initially, engaging with the Yoga Sutra. So, it's one of those things that's it's complicated, and people obviously have a lot of different opinions on it.
Just kind of say one thing on
yes,
that.
Please.
Is that I think you can take it both ways. Like even if you want to try and squeeze your asana practice into the Yoga Sutras, there is, I'm forgetting the sutra, the Sanskrit's not coming to me, but there is, in the first chapter, there's a sutra that, you can meditate on whatever you want. And so you can say, okay, I'm going to make my asana the alambana, the object or the basis for my meditation. But I think it's a difficult, my question is whether there's sort of a sunk cost fallacy where people who have spent years and years in their asana practice think it's going to by itself take them all the way. I haven't done that in that way, so I can't make a claim, but I have serious doubts. From a Vedanta perspective, it's like what you're saying, that asana practice can be used as an incredible tool, and you can go so deep and learn so much and do so much discipline, so much phenomenological inquiry, so much, embodied, and also the way it's tied into the modern world, like somatic psychology and all this other stuff. And so you can bring all that in and grow so much. But it's within the yoga tradition. It's always classical yoga traditions. No one considered it a means by itself.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Well, let's leave it in that provocative statement. But I wanted to ask you. We have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask you. I wanted to get to a question about Mind and Life because I know you're involved with Mind and Life Institute, and I was curious about that because they're traditionally a kind of Buddhist organization. So, are they doing something differently in inviting in those from perspectives like Vedanta? Is it sort of like another line of research, or what's happening at Mind and Life that has brought you on board?
That's where they want to go. So I think Mind and Life is, of course, they're originally inspired by the Dalai Lama and the Dalai Lama's interactions with neuroscientists, particularly one named Varela, who is not alive anymore, but was hugely influential in the sort of birth of neuroscientific research into meditation. And so I would say their real emphasis is, though they hold Buddhism very dearly and tightly, and they still do this conversation with the Dalai Lama and et cetera, but their real emphasis is more on the neuroscience, clinical psychology, and also contemplative pedagogical research that's going on. And so they're sort of, I don't know if I would claim that they're Buddhist centered, but of course they're Buddhist centered in that everything that has come out into the field of contemplative studies broadly, including the neuroscience and the psychology, is mostly Buddhist centric, right? Mindfulness centered, actually, probably 90% of it. And I do think Mind and Life is realizing that there's a much broader world of contemplative studies.
Yeah.
Not just in India, but indigenous traditions, African traditions, even in Christianity or Judaism or whatever. And so they're starting to broaden and look for more voices. And I think they're just really on the cusp of doing that and trying to bring in more. So yeah, I think it was actually something I had a talk with some of them about, so I was at their Summer Research Institute last summer up in Garrison, New York.
Yeah, I love Garrison. City. I was recently up there.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful retreat center. And so I was talking to a lot of people there about who are not in the field of philosophy or the religious studies. And they're doing, so neuroscientists and psychologists, and they're doing work on Buddhist-inspired, Buddhist-based meditation practices, but they really didn't know much about the Buddhist traditions, so, many of them at least. And not that they didn't want to, it's just they didn't have, it's a difficult field to enter into. And Buddhist philosophy has also remained, Indian philosophy in general, the Buddhist philosophy less so because of Mind and Life, but it remains in its own sort of, little niche. Mm-hmm. And so much terminology and technicalities and textual stuff, and so it hasn't translated as much. And so I was just raising these points with several people that within Mind and Life that there's this whole wider world of contemplative practices that we're not tapping into, whether it's non-dual tantra or whether it's Advaita Vedanta, and beautiful in forms of contemplative pursuits. For example, like visualization practices has been very little studied upon that, or like this karma yoga I was talking about earlier. How does that become a contemplative practice? And what do we do with not things that don't fit into a secular mindset? What do we do with these sort of practices? And there's also raises issues of appropriation within contemplative studies. And so the way the funding works is that someone doing psychology, they need to narrow in on a secular practice or extract it to be secular, because there's this utilitarian perspective of how are we going to bring this out into the North American world. And so the way the funding works, the way the research works, and some raising some issues around that as well. And so now there are people who are starting to look into that. And so yeah, but anyways, Mind and Life is super receptive. They're not at all. Kudos to them is that they, in talking to them, they are not like no, we need to tight. They're like, how do we do this?
That's interesting. It's exciting to hear that, because I even in embodied philosophy, we initially would use the term Eastern philosophy a lot, and then obviously there's lots of problems, again, like you had mentioned earlier, with the designation Eastern versus Western, and so we've moved away from that and used the term contemplative studies more often. But I encountered, which has always that makes sense as an umbrella term to encompass all of these different traditions, but I did encounter someone once who I used the term contemplative studies, and they thought specifically Buddhists. They were like, oh, Buddhists, because they were sort of the first to use this term contemplative studies. And so it's taken on this kind of resonance of being associated with Buddhism. So it's good that this kind of forging open of that category to include and encompass more approaches and perspectives is great. But yeah, I hear what you're saying. It's sort of, that's always the question that I have is, how do you invite a conversation of a tradition whose central axiom is the realization of God, whether or not you want to use the term God to talk about it, but like in the very act of making secular that the practices that are associated with that, you are leaving something out, you are misappropriating that. And so it'll be interesting to see how they resolve or respond to that challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't have a good answer to that. I think that's a tough one.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right in that. So I'm on the organizing committee for Mind and Life's next really big research conference, which will be next November in the University of Wisconsin. And so this is part of our discussion was how are we defining the call for the conference, and what is contemplative studies. And so we left it very, very open. It has to be rigorous research. It's academic. That this conference is going to be like a purely academic conference. But it can be from various disciplines, within the humanities or within the sciences or within psychology, and from various traditions. And so we're really clear on trying to do that. But what's interesting is that everyone in their own field tends to view it from their own field.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like neuroscientists working on contemplative studies, they might be like, well, what does philosophy have to offer? It might be. I'm not saying they all are, but there's a tendency to that. And then Indian philosophers might be like, well, isn't the neuroscientist sort of derivative from the stuff that's coming out of the tradition? And well, they don't really understand the tradition. So what are they missing? Or how do they interpret? So here's just one example is where I think they actually have to intersect is just to give one example is if you're doing a study of advanced meditators out of a tradition, right? So these Tibetan Buddhist monks, for example, some of these studies have been done on them. And then they're reporting their experiences to a researcher who doesn't have a really deep intimacy with that tradition. What miscommunications take place?
Yeah.
In terms of, because the practitioner is within the framework of their philosophical, cultural, textual context, and trying to translate it for the researcher, but the researcher has to understand that context to understand the responses. So
yeah.
So I'm hoping that this dialogue takes place more. I'm actually hoping that Indian philosophy there's a resurgence of that within the field of contemplative studies, which is majorly dominated by the sciences. That's why I'm saying the Buddhists, I sort of have this question of, even though we say contemplative studies, the assumption might be it's Buddhist. In my experience, it's not Buddhist that much in the sense of really understanding I'd say the earlier researchers probably were, like people who were early on in Mind and Life were closely associated with Tibetan Buddhists and stuff like that. But now it's exploded, right? The field has just exploded. So I think that a lot of researchers now are not as familiar.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, this is all very exciting. Is there anything else before we stop that you want to share about anything that's coming up for you? Are you doing any? Well, you're teaching a course for embodied philosophy called Non-Duality, and it's I believe Seeking or Encountering Wholeness through the Advaita Vedanta or something like that, and it's starting on February 20th. And this interview will come out this week. Perhaps we'll get it out tomorrow. So those who are listening have a couple of weeks to jump on board with that. And you can find, of course, information about that at embodiedphilosophy.com. Is there anything else that's coming up, Neil, that you'd like to share?
With me, not so much. Just doing mostly my academic work. But I'm really excited about this course. And just for people who are interested, I'd maybe just note that I'm going to come at it from both sides, one as the scholar and one as a traditional teacher. I do teach an ongoing class where I'm located here in Canada. And it's a little difficult to compress it all, but I want to give that traditional element because to me, as we were talking before, if you're not using these traditions, it's actually exactly apropos to what we were talking about, is we have to have the history, we have to have it's helpful to have a conceptual understanding, but the danger is when we have a conceptual understanding of something like Vedanta or Mahayana Buddhism or whatever, is that then we think we know. We can give like the elevator pitch. Yeah. This is what they're saying. Yeah. But we've actually undermined ourselves because you haven't turned it towards yourself. Yeah. So what I really want to do in the course with you is to turn that. And the most important thing I think in yoga in general, in Vedanta in particular, is that we're dealing with a phenomenal logical inquiry. It's an inquiry into our experience. It's not an inquiry. It's not doing philosophy in the way that we in the academy do philosophy. And the whole thing is looking at yourself and using the models of the tradition. So people are familiar with things like the 5 koshas, the 5 sheets, or this and that kind of stuff that comes up in maybe in a yoga teacher training. That is all about how do you look at yourself through those models. They're models. They're not trying to make these hard factual claims that you actually have these 5 sheets. They're just ways of they're maps to look into your experience.
Yeah.
And those maps then lead you to understanding yourself as the whole. So yeah, I just want to invite everyone who's interested in that to come and check it out, and hopefully
Yeah.
you understand Vedanta, but you gain some insight into yourself.
Yeah, I think it's going to be great. I'm really looking forward to it. And thank you so much, Neil. This has been a fantastic conversation. We went way longer than I thought we would, but I think we covered some really good material. So thank you for taking your time to speak with me today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was great.